The wind shifted at dusk, carrying the scent of pine sap and distant water, thick with silence. The lake sat still as glass, untouched and unwelcoming. A hush had settled over the sanctuary grounds. Not the kind that brought peace, but the kind that warned something was missing. Beyond the perimeter fence, volunteers moved like ghosts through the underbrush, calling her name over and over again as if repetition might conjure her from the shadows. Sophie hadn't come back from her morning rounds. She was supposed to feed Echo, the newly rescued Mustang they kept in the outer paddock, and then help May with the foals in the east barn. But by lunchtime, her boots were still missing from the porch rack. By dinner, the entire ranch knew. A jacket was found first, snagged on the reeds near the dock. Pale blue, faded from wear. Sophie's. Then a boot, half sunk in the mud at the waterline. Sheriff Mays arrived just after 6, scanning the shoreline with a tight jaw and a flashlight beam that didn't reach far enough. The dogs wouldn't track past the dock. No drag marks, no scuffle. Just silence and the aching, open question of where she'd gone. Echo hadn't moved all day. He stood in his paddock like a carved statue, head high, nostrils wide, eyes pinned toward the lake. No halter, no fence. No one had ever managed to get close enough. They called him a ghost horse. Feral, battered, pulled for the edge of a canyon fire 2 weeks ago. He'd kicked through 2 trailers and once shattered a water trough trying to escape. But Sophie had sat with him, not training, not touching, just sat for hours, sometimes with a book in her lap, sometimes humming tuneless melodies. No one understood it, least of all May, who'd spent her life coaxing broken horses into trust with a mix of grit and soft hands. She talks to him like she remembers something the rest of us forgot. May had said once, watching them from the shadow of the barn. Now Sophie was gone, and Echo, the wild one, hadn't blinked since they found her jacket. Marla, the ranch nurse, paced near the paddock gate, walkie-talkie pressed to her chest. He hasn't eaten, not a flake of hay, not a drop of water. That's not fear. That's mourning. Cal leaned against the post beside her, eyes dark under his brim. Or he knows something we don't. The lake shimmered in the distance, bruised under the dying light. Then, without a sound, Echo moved. It wasn't frantic. It wasn't sudden. He simply turned toward the open gate, stepped over the half-closed latch, and began to walk. No one spoke. Not the handlers. Not the volunteers. Not even Sheriff Mays, whose hand rested instinctively on his belt. The Mustang passed them all, hooves thudding softly over earth still damp from last night's rain. Muscles rippled beneath his soot-colored coat, ribs visible but proud. His mane caught the wind like torn silk. He reached the lake in under a minute, stopped just at the edge. No one followed. Not yet. Echo lowered his head, snorted once, then stepped into the water. A sharp intake of breath swept the crowd. Cal took a step forward. Is he? But the words fell away. Echo kept walking. Ankles, knees, belly. His body dipped lower with each step. But his head stayed high, eyes locked ahead like he saw something just beyond the surface. Ripples spread out from his legs, disturbing the perfect stillness. Marla clutched the gate with white knuckles. May's lips parted, but no sound came. The lake deepened quickly. Everyone knew the drop-off came 10 feet out. Echo didn't hesitate. With a final push from his hind legs, he slipped from wading to swimming, his shoulders slicing through the water, black against the gold of the sunset. He's going somewhere, May whispered. He's not panicking. He's aiming. The reeds rustled across the lake, about 20 yards from shore. A small bend in the shoreline where the trees crowded thick and the shadows pooled early. Sheriff Mays turned his radio to max volume and barked for the boats. But it was Echo who reached her first, a flicker in the weeds. Pale skin. Fingers. The gasp that tore through the crowd was primal. Echo reached the cluster of reeds and stopped. His body strained, legs kicking to stay afloat, but his head dipped once, bumping gently into the floating form. Then again. A girl's head broke the surface, coughing weakly. Marla screamed, "She's alive!" Chaos surged behind them. Rescue crews, ropes shouting. But Echo didn't leave her. He stayed there, chest heaving, keeping her buoyed with the side of his neck, nuzzling her shoulder until hands finally reached her from a rescue boat. She was barely conscious, bruised, lips blue, but her arms moved, faint, trembling, and her first word, hoarse and wet, was a whisper no one could hear. They lifted her into the boat. The Mustang turned once, watching, and then, slowly, he began to swim back. May stood waiting with a blanket. Her hands shook. Echo emerged from the water and stopped just shy of the crowd. The sun behind him threw light like fire through his soaked mane. His legs trembled. His ribs rose and fell too fast. But his eyes were calm. "You knew," Cal murmured, breathless. Echo lowered his head. Then he dropped to his knees. He didn't collapse. He knelt, gently, deliberately, and the world stopped moving. Later, they would call it a miracle. Say the Mustang had been guided by instinct. That Sophie had drifted into the reeds. That she'd been lucky. That the horse had followed a scent, a sound, a shadow. But none of them would forget the look in his eyes. The way he swam like he'd done it before. Like the lake wasn't a boundary, but a bridge. Sophie was airlifted to County General. The helicopter blades thumped against the sky as Echo stood watching from the shore. May kept a hand on his neck, grounding him. He didn't flinch at the sound, just watched. The crowd dispersed slowly, whispers chasing one another into the growing dark. Back at the paddock, Cal tossed down fresh hay. Echo didn't eat it. He stood by the fence until midnight, staring into the dark beyond the trees. At dawn, when the sky was still soft and pink and the mist curled low over the fields, Echo let out a long, low whinny. No one heard it but the birds. But far away, in a sterile white room lit by machines, Sophie opened her eyes. The scent of antiseptic clung to every corner of the hospital room. Too clean, too cold. Machines clicked inside beside Sophie's bed, monitoring rhythms too fragile to trust on their own. Her face was pale, eyelids fluttering in the half-light, lashes damp against skin that hadn't seen sun in days. Her fingers twitched once, slow and searching, like she was feeling for something familiar that wasn't there. She hadn't spoken since the lake. Not to her parents. Not to nurses. Not even to the sheriff, who came twice a day and sat awkwardly in the corner chair, asking questions she wouldn't answer. She opened her eyes now and then, blinked at shadows. Sometimes she mouthed words, but no sound followed. Mostly, she just stared toward the window, the one that overlooked the hospital's east courtyard, the one they'd wheeled Echo into just before dawn. May had driven him there herself, refusing to let anyone else handle the trailer. She had arrived with wind in her hair, boots muddy, jaw set like stone. She asked for him, she told the nurse at the front desk, her voice low and rough. Not water, not food, him. They let her in. Echo stepped down slow, his coat duller than usual, eyes restless. But the moment he caught her scent on the air, he stilled. He stood in the courtyard like he'd been waiting all his life to return. Sophie's window overlooked the side path. Her mother pulled back the curtain with trembling fingers. The girl's eyes flicked upward, and her lips parted. For the first time since being pulled from the lake, she sat up on her own, hands flat on the blanket. She didn't speak, didn't cry. She simply looked down at him, as though her lungs remembered how to breathe only when he was near. May stood by the railing, one hand lightly on Echo's withers, the other adjusting the angle so the horse could see her better. His ears perked. He let out a low, soft whicker. Sophie closed her eyes, and a tear slid silently into her hair. That night, she whispered, not to the nurses, not to her father, but to Echo through the glass. "You came back." Her voice cracked on the second word, more breath than sound, but it was there, alive, trembling, real. Her father had been dozing in the chair beside her bed. He sat bolt upright, stunned. When he tried to speak, she only held up a hand, palm facing the window. The gesture was enough to keep him quiet. She stayed like that until sleep pulled her under again, hand against the glass, as if distance meant nothing between them. The next day, May brought a folding chair to the courtyard and stayed with Echo from morning until sunset. She spoke little. occasionally hummed old songs with no words. Echo stood beside her, unmoving, waiting for the second-story window to light up. Sophie watched from her bed, fingers always curled over the edge of her blanket, her eyes never straying far from him. It became routine. Echo in the courtyard, Sophie at the window. On the third day, she was strong enough to sit outside. They bundled her in blankets and wheeled her through the hallway, past the beeping and murmurs and rubber-soled footsteps. The nurses had cleared a path. Even the janitor paused mid-mop to nod as she passed. Sophie's father walked beside her silently, unsure whether to hold her hand or let it rest in her lap. When they reached the courtyard, Echo lifted his head. His breath fogged the air. He didn't move, didn't rush to her. He waited. The wheelchair stopped 5 feet from him. Sophie leaned forward. For a moment, nothing happened. Her arms trembled, her jaw clenched. Then, slowly, with the care of someone piecing themselves back together, she raised her hand. Echo stepped forward. One step, then another. He lowered his head until his muzzle hovered inches from her palm. Then he pressed into it, firm and soft and sure. Her fingers curled into his mane. Her breath hitched, and then she laughed. Just once, but the sound was clear. Her father turned away quickly, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. May nodded once, barely visible behind Echo's flank. The bond between them wasn't something that had formed in that lake. It had started long before, in the silence between feeding times, in the quiet morning hours before the others arrived, in the way Sophie had once told May, "He doesn't need words, and neither do I." She hadn't meant it to be profound, but it was. After her brother died, Sophie had stopped speaking for a full 6 months. She couldn't stand how loud grief was, how loud pity was. Everyone kept telling her it would get better, that time healed. But no one knew how to be quiet with her. Echo had. From the moment she first saw him behind the fencing, legs shaking, burns scabbed over, wildness still burning in his eyes, she knew he was like her. Something once whole, now trying to remember what it meant to trust. May watched their reunion quietly from a bench, her hands folded around a thermos. Her own voice had been taken years ago by surgery, a laryngectomy that left her with no way to speak above a whisper. But she hadn't needed a voice to teach Sophie how to read horses. She just needed presence, patience, the slow rhythm of hands and heart. Back inside the hospital, Sophie's mother clipped photos to the corkboard beside her bed. Most were of Sophie and her brother before the flood, then a few of the ranch. Then Echo. She had dozens. Sophie brushing his coat, Sophie reading beside his paddock, Sophie laughing as he stole a carrot from her lap. Now she added one more, taken earlier that day in the courtyard. Sophie's head against Echo's, eyes closed, smile soft. Later, when the room quieted again, Sophie turned to her mother. "He knew I was there," she said, voice still thin, but stronger than it had been. "I heard him. When I was under." Her mother froze, fingers tightening around the edge of a blanket. "I thought I was alone," Sophie whispered. "But I wasn't." Outside, a wind stirred to the courtyard. Echo raised his head toward the sky. May placed her hand gently against his shoulder, grounding him once more. That night, Sophie didn't ask for pain medication. She didn't need the TV or the nurse or the lights on. She asked for the curtain to stay open, and she watched him sleep. The snow came early that year, brushing the pines with white before the leaves had finished falling. At the sanctuary, frost bit into the edges of the water troughs by morning and lingered long after the sun had risen. Most of the horses had grown their winter coats, but Echo's remained thin, his body still recovering from the fire's toll. May wrapped his flanks in a wool blanket every night and let him stand where he pleased during the day, though he rarely strayed far from the paddock fence that faced the house. From the porch, Sophie sat bundled in 2 jackets, a scarf, and fingerless gloves, her hands curled around a warm mug. She still hadn't returned to school. Her legs worked again, but her voice hadn't entirely come back. Not the way it was before. She could speak now, yes, but only when it mattered, and only to a few. Her father joined her most mornings. At first, he'd hovered, unsure whether to speak or stay quiet, unsure whether silence would help or only remind her of all the things left unsaid. But lately, they'd found a rhythm. He'd sip his coffee. She'd watch the paddock. Sometimes, one of them would break the stillness with a question like tossing a pebble into a still lake, just to see what would ripple. "You think he's waiting for snow?" he asked once, his voice low and uncertain. Sophie shrugged. Maybe he remembers it. From where he came from? Or from when he almost didn't make it through? He didn't ask what she meant. He just nodded. May appeared on the path that led from the lower barn, her old coat flapping like sails in the wind. Echo perked up as she approached, ears forward, neck high. He'd learned to trust her almost as much as Sophie now, though his wariness never fully disappeared. Not even when she brought his favorite grain mash laced with molasses and peppermint. "We're starting water work again," May called up the porch. Sophie stood slowly. Her legs still ached in the morning cold, but she welcomed the pain. It reminded her she was here. They walked the path together, May, Sophie, and Echo. The water training pen had been set up near the creek, a shallow stone-lined enclosure that filled with meltwater runoff. It wasn't deep, but it was enough. Sophie held the lead rope loosely in one hand. Echo didn't need it, but she liked the feel of it between her fingers. Not control. Connection. The first time they'd tried this weeks ago, he'd panicked. Not violently, just stopped. His whole body stiffened, and he wouldn't go near the edge of the pool. Sophie hadn't pushed. She'd sat down beside him in the dirt, knees drawn up, and whispered that she understood. Now, on their fifth try, he stepped forward without hesitation. Not fast, not eager, but willing. Sophie's boots crunched over gravel as she walked with him into the cold water. Her breath caught at the touch of it against her ankles, but she didn't stop. Echo moved beside her, shoulders tense, eyes scanning the trees. "I used to dream of drowning," she said suddenly. Her voice was soft, breath fogging the air in front of her. "After the flood, after my brother, I thought if I kept dreaming about it, I'd stop being afraid." May stayed quiet, arms crossed loosely. She watched from a distance, her expression unreadable. It never worked. But then, Sophie turned her head, meeting Echo's gaze. "You went in after me, and it stopped feeling like something I had to face alone." Echo lowered his head slightly, nudging her side. They reached the middle of the pool. The water lapped just below her knees. She stopped, looked up at the sky. Light snow had started falling, gentle, patient, like a reminder from something older than words. "We're going to be okay," she whispered. "Aren't we?" Echo snorted softly. May stepped forward then, boots crunching. She reached out, signed a few words in the air. Sophie had learned her signals well enough by now to catch the message. "He trusts you. He's learning again because of you." Sophie nodded, her throat thick. They stayed like that until the cold crept too far up her legs, and May gave the sign to head back. Back at the barn, Sophie brushed Echo down with long, practiced strokes. His coat was starting to thicken, slow but sure. His ribs weren't as sharp. His eyes stayed calmer, less wild, though the fire never fully left them. She liked that. She never wanted him fully tame. "He doesn't like being still," she said as May handed her a fresh blanket. "Even when he looks calm, he's always listening." "Like you," May signed. Sophie smiled, then paused. "I miss my brother." May's hand stilled. She looked at her for a long moment, then signed one word. "Always." That night, her father lit a fire in the old pit behind the house. Sophie came out with a blanket and sat beside him. He poked at the coals with a stick until they glowed brighter, then cleared his throat. "I used to think you stopped talking because of grief," he said. "But I think now it's because nobody was listening the right way." Sophie said nothing, just pulled the blanket tighter. He kept going, voice low. "I didn't listen. Not the way you needed. I thought if I stayed strong it would help you. But maybe you didn't need strength. Maybe you just needed space." Sophie turned toward him slowly. "I needed someone to sit with me in the silence. That's all." He nodded, eyes wet in the firelight. "I'm learning." A pause. Then she leaned her head against his shoulder. Behind them, the wind rustled through the trees. Echo stood just beyond the fence, still and watching, his silhouette framed by stars. And for the first time in months, Sophie didn't dream of drowning. The lake had thawed by April, though it still held a kind of hush, as if remembering too well what it had taken and what it had almost kept. Pale morning light shimmered on its surface, casting silver across the shallows where reeds now grew green again. A light fog curled above the water, not thick enough to obscure, just enough to soften the lines between past and present. Sophie stood at the edge of the dock, boots planted, breath visible in the chill. She wore no coat, only a worn denim jacket with frayed cuffs and a small stitch patch on the back, one she'd sewn herself, a rough silhouette of a Mustang beneath a crescent moon. Her hands trembled slightly, not from the cold, but from something deeper, something she hadn't named aloud yet. Behind her, the ranch had gathered in quiet reverence. There was no grand announcement, no ribbon, no music, just folding chairs lined up in loose rows, and thermoses passed between gloved hands. May stood near the edge of the crowd, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Sophie's parents waited by the fence, not speaking, eyes locked on their daughter as if afraid she might vanish again the moment they looked away. Echo stood beside Sophie, untethered. No saddle, no bridle, just the soft sound of his breathing, steady as waves lapping at the dock. This wasn't a show. It wasn't part of the fundraiser or the outreach campaign or the sanctuary's new visitor day. Sophie had asked her this morning quietly, almost in a whisper, weeks earlier. No flyers, no fanfare, just her and Echo. One more walk into the water, not to relive it, not to prove anything, but to finish something that had been left unfinished. She glanced down at him now. He met her eyes, ears flicking forward, then stepped lightly onto the dock. His hooves clacked against the wood with a surety that made something in Sophie's chest loosen. She took her first step forward. Each board creaked beneath her weight, but she didn't stop. The dock swayed faintly. She could hear birds beginning their chorus in the trees beyond. A few soft calls from the crowd, the click of a camera someone had forgotten to silence. Echo stayed at her side. When they reached the edge, Sophie paused. The wind tugged gently at her hair. She looked down at the place where her jacket had once floated, tangled in reeds. The water below was calm, clear, her lips parted. A breath, steady now. Then she stepped down. The lake water, still touched by winter, wrapped around her ankles, cold but not biting. Her boot sank slightly into the soft silt. She didn't flinch, didn't pull away. Echo followed her without hesitation, his hooves churning the shallows into gentle ripples. Together, they walked, knee-deep, thigh-deep. Sophie reached a point where she could feel the shift in the lake bed slope, the way it dropped off just past a cluster of rocks now visible under the surface. This was where she'd gone under. Her heart stuttered once. But Echo was there, close enough to touch. His flank brushed against her hip, his head turned toward her. "I'm okay," she whispered, unsure if the words were meant for him or herself. A hush fell over people on shore. Sophie closed her eyes, then took one more step forward, just at the edge of the drop, and stopped. The air held its breath. Then, slowly, she turned back. Her voice, when it came, was stronger than it had been in months. "I came here that day because I thought I heard my brother calling," she said, voice carrying across the water. "But I wasn't trying to follow him. I was trying to find what I'd lost." She looked down at Echo. "I didn't know it was still with me." May stepped forward, only a few paces, but enough that Sophie saw her nod. Sophie smiled, soft and steady. "I thought the water took everything," she said, "but I was wrong." She pressed a hand against Echo's shoulder. The horse lowered his head in return, breath slow and warm against her palm. "I came back," she said simply, "and he did too." Silence followed, but it was a full silence, rich in listening. Her father moved first, stepping toward the edge of the dock. One hand raised his heart. Her mother followed, wrapping an arm around his waist. People began to clap, hesitantly at first, then stronger. Not loud, not forced, just enough to echo softly against the trees. Sophie and Echo waded back together. As they reached the shoreline, a small boy broke free from the crowd and ran to meet them, eyes wide, cheeks flushed. He stopped short when he saw the water still clinging to Echo's legs, but Sophie knelt beside him. "It's not as deep as it looks," she said gently. "Weren't you scared?" She looked up at the horse. "I was. And now," she smiled, "now I'm grateful." The boy looked at Echo, then back at Sophie, then nodded solemnly before hurrying back to his mother. By the time the sun cleared the last of the clouds, Sophie had changed into dry clothes and sat on the fence near the barn, legs swinging lazily. Echo grazed nearby, pausing now and then to nudge her knee. May leaned against the post beside her. "You did more than walk into the lake," May said, her voice gravel-soft. Sophie didn't look at her, just kept watching Echo. "You walked back out with something new." "I don't know what it is yet," Sophie said. "You don't have to. Just carry it." Later that evening, after the last guest had gone and the sun dipped low behind the ridge, Sophie returned to the dock one more time, alone this time. No audience, no cameras, just her and the lake. She didn't go in. She simply stood there, hands tucked into her pockets, eyes reflecting the shifting light. Behind her, soft hoofbeats approached. "Echo!" He stopped beside her, the breeze tousling his mane. She didn't reach for him. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. They stood that way until the stars began to blink to life above them, until the cold crept up through the boards beneath their feet, and the world felt still again, not empty, not silent, just still and full.